By the time the livestock trailer turned off County Road 14 and rattled toward Hollow Creek Farm, 3 pickup trucks had already slowed to watch. The trailer came in behind a faded red Ford, whose tailgate was held shut with chain. Dust lifted from the gravel and rolled over the roadside ditch, hanging in the cold March light until truck, trailer, and barn seemed half erased inside a brown haze. Through the metal slats came the scraping of webbed feet, the hard slap of wings against steel, and thin, exhausted cries that rose and fell without rhythm. Mara Bennett waited beside the machine shed with one hand tucked into the pocket of her canvas jacket. She was 24 years old, 5 months into owning a farm she had never expected to inherit so soon, and nearly $186,000 in debt. Inside the trailer were 800 ducks. They looked worse once the ramp came down. Some stood with their necks tucked close, feathers greasy and broken. Others remained crouched on the floor while healthier birds stumbled around them, breastbones pressed sharply beneath loose skin. Several had swollen feet. One bird was missing most of the feathers along its back. Another tried to follow the flock down the ramp, made it 3 steps into the dust, then lowered itself as though those few feet had used the last strength in its body. Across the road, a silver pickup slowed almost to a stop. The driver leaned toward the passenger side window. Mara did not look up. She lifted the weak duck against her chest, felt how little it weighed, and carried it toward a water pan beneath the barn awning. By noon, 2 more trucks had passed. By late afternoon, a man from the feed store had driven down County Road 14 on an errand that did not normally take him anywhere near Hollow Creek. Mara spent the rest of the day unloading birds, spreading straw, cleaning troughs, and dividing the weakest from those strong enough to stand. The sour smell of sick poultry worked itself into her clothes and hair. Damp straw stuck to her boots. By sunset, her shoulders burned, her hands were red from cold water, and several dozen birds had still refused feed. What drew even more attention over the next week was not that she had bought them. It was what she did afterward. There was an old poultry house behind the barn, but Mara left most of it empty. Instead, she dragged electric netting toward the field edges. She repaired 2 rusted stock tanks, bolted salvaged roofing tin onto an old utility trailer, and marked narrow strips along the drainage ditch, the wheat stubble, and the alfalfa fields with fiberglass posts. From the county road, it looked as if she were turning productive farm ground into a wandering duckyard. One afternoon, a truck stopped near the mailbox while Mara drove posts beside the south field. 2 men sat inside with the windows down. Neither got out. One rested an elbow on the door and watched several hundred thin birds crowd against the temporary fence behind her. The other shook his head slowly, then looked toward the farmhouse as though calculating how long before the bank owned it. The truck eventually rolled on. Mara drove the next post into the ground. She never explained why the ducks were there. Hollow Creek Farm had been in the Bennett family for 3 generations. Her grandfather Eli had bought the first 80 acres when the farmhouse still had a hand pump beside the porch and only one electrical line running into the kitchen. Mara's father, Daniel, added ground slowly whenever neighboring parcels came up for sale. By the time Mara reached high school, Hollow Creek had grown to 170 acres of wheat, alfalfa, hay ground, pasture, rough creek bottom, and crooked field margins that never looked quite right on a county map. It was not a wealthy farm, but for most of Mara's childhood, it had been steady. Then Daniel got sick. At first, the change appeared in small things. Feed sacks remained where they had been dropped, because lifting them left him breathless. A gate beside the north pasture sagged through an entire summer because he no longer had the strength to reset the hinge. One July afternoon, Mara came home from community college and found the John Deere sitting halfway across a field, engine cold, unfinished windrows bleaching beneath the sun. Her father was asleep at the kitchen table. Medical appointments multiplied, so did bills. A dry year cut the hay crop. The wheat harvest that followed barely covered diesel, fertilizer, and custom trucking. The old baler needed a nodder assembly. The tractor overheated twice. Roof panels lifted from the barn during a spring storm and were never replaced. Daniel Bennett died in November. For the first few weeks afterward, Mara did not think about ownership. She thought about casseroles left on the porch, sympathy cards stacked beside the coffee maker, and the strange quiet of a house that still seemed arranged around a man who was no longer inside it. His work coat remained hanging behind the mudroom door. Mara tried to move it once. Her fingers closed around the stiff canvas sleeve, rough with years of dust and grease, and the familiar smell rose from the fabric before she was ready for it. Diesel, cold air, old hay, and the faint mineral scent of machine oil. For one sharp second, she could almost feel her father brushing past her on the way outside before dawn. Her throat locked. She let go. The coat swung once on its hook and settled back against the wall. It stayed there. When February came, grief had to share the kitchen table with arithmetic. Hollow Creek was worth enough to erase its debt if she sold enough land. That was the clean solution. A development company had already offered to buy 32 acres near the highway. The parcel was flat, accessible, and worth more than any other piece of ground on the farm. Selling it would have paid down the loan, bought time, and probably put a newer tractor in the shed. Mara refused. After that, people stopped treating her situation as temporary grief and began treating it as stubbornness. At the diner, men who had worked beside Daniel for decades watched her enter, then lowered their voices as she passed. At the feed store, the clerk rang up poultry netting, glanced at the total on her account, and looked from the receipt to Mara with a hesitation that said more than a warning could have. When the banker came to inspect the property securing the loan, he stepped out of his sedan in polished shoes and stood beside the machine shed while several hundred ragged ducks shoved through a temporary gate. His eyes moved from the flock to the old tractor, then to the weathered barn. He spent longer looking at the movable duck shelter than he did at any piece of machinery. No one needed to say much. A 24-year-old woman with a failing farm had spent nearly all her cash on 800 birds nobody else wanted. To most of Hollow Creek County, the story had already found its ending. Mara had found the beginning, months earlier, in an upstairs room that still smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. Her grandfather Eli had kept farm notebooks for almost 40 years. Mara found 18 of them inside a dented ammunition box beneath old seed catalogs and tax records. Their covers were soft from use, corners curled, pages browned where dirty fingers had turned them in wet weather. Most entries were ordinary: rainfall totals, first frost, hay tonnage, diesel prices, fence repairs, cattle weights. One notebook from the late 1980s was different. Through June and July, the same subject kept appearing: grasshoppers. Eli had tracked them before anyone else in the family remembered there being a serious problem. He noted dry spring weather, bare roadside ground, insects rising from ditch grass when trucks passed, then stripped alfalfa edges and neighboring fields sprayed twice because fresh insects kept moving in from rough ground. Near the bottom of one page was an observation Mara read 3 times. The worst damage had stopped short of the old chicken lot. There was no grand theory beneath it, no claim that Eli had discovered anything. He simply wrote that the hens ranged beyond the yard every morning, picking through the grass before the heat drove them back toward shade, and that the nearby forage had not been hit as hard. Mara remembered the foundation of that chicken lot from childhood. She also remembered her father teaching her that bad grasshopper years announced themselves quietly. He had once stopped along a roadside, pulled apart dry grass with 2 fingers, and shown her tiny nymphs hopping over the dirt. By the time everyone saw the disaster, he had told her, the important part had usually happened weeks earlier. Mara did not build a plan from one faded sentence. She spent January reading extension papers Daniel had saved in a filing cabinet. She studied where grasshoppers laid egg pods, why warm, dry springs favored survival, and how young nymphs often concentrated along field borders before growing mobile enough to travel farther. She read about poultry foraging. She studied rotational grazing. She calculated acreage and feed, 800 ducks would never erase an outbreak across an entire county. But Hollow Creek was not an entire county. It was 170 acres. Mara did not need a miracle. She needed pressure in the right places at the right time. The birds she bought were useful because nobody else wanted them. The failed poultry operation 70 miles south needed them gone immediately. Mara paid a fraction of what healthy birds would have cost and gambled that she could restore enough of the flock before summer. For several weeks, that gamble looked foolish. 23 ducks died despite everything she did. Mara learned to recognize the birds that would not make morning. She began each day before sunrise with a flashlight, moving through the recovery pen while the barn walls still held the night's cold. She washed infected feet, replaced wet bedding, soaked grain for birds too weak to eat dry feed, and kept records on every loss. A coyote tested the west fence in late April. The first scream woke Mara at 4:12 in the morning. She ran from the farmhouse with her coat unzipped and socks shoved into work boots, flashlight beam bouncing across the yard. By the time she reached the paddock, the flock had compressed into a frantic mass against one corner. Netting lay twisted in the grass. Feathers drifted across the beam. 9 ducks were dead. For the rest of the morning, Mara repaired fence with hands that shook from cold and anger. That afternoon, she spent money reserved for tractor parts on stronger netting and a better fence charger. 3 days later, the water pump failed. For nearly a week, she hauled water in a tank strapped into the bed of her father's 1998 Ford. The passenger door would not open from the outside. The dashboard lights flickered whenever she hit a pothole, and the tailgate chain slapped against the body all the way across the fields. Still, by May, the flock had changed. The birds that once sat helplessly on the trailer floor now surged through gates in a broad, noisy wave. Feathers filled in, legs strengthened. Their heads disappeared into grass as soon as they reached a fresh strip. Mara watched what they chose. Beetles vanished first. Crickets disappeared. Larvae were hunted from damp patches, and anything that jumped from grass drew instant pursuit. She began carrying an old sweep net. Before moving ducks into a paddock, she crossed the grass with a fixed number of sweeps and counted what she caught. She repeated the same process after the birds worked the strip. Alongside those counts, she recorded feed use, paddock time, temperature, rainfall, and vegetation recovery. The results were not spectacular enough to impress anyone driving past. They were consistent enough to keep Mara interested. By late May, the ducks were taking part of their diet from the fields. Broadleaf weeds were grazed before setting seed. Insects were noticeably fewer in heavily worked strips. After small rains, certain paddocks returned greener where manure had been scattered thinly across the surface. At the diner one morning, Mara entered with mud drying on her jeans and found 3 farmers seated by the window. One had worked beside Daniel for almost 20 years. Another owned more acreage than the Bennett family ever had. Their conversation stopped when Mara crossed the room. One man's eyes dropped to her boots. Another glanced toward the old pickup parked outside, its bed carrying a roll of poultry netting. A smile moved briefly across his mouth. Mara ordered coffee to go. 10 minutes later, she was back home counting insects. June arrived with heat that seemed to harden the county. Rain clouds formed west of Hollow Creek, dark enough to raise hope, then broke apart before reaching the farm. The drainage ditch shrank to a narrow ribbon. Pastures lost their spring softness. Dust collected along fence wires and hung behind early wheat combines. A letter from the bank arrived on a Monday. Mara left it unopened until after dark. When she finally sat down, the farmhouse was quiet except for the refrigerator cycling and moths tapping against the screen above the sink. The envelope lay beside a baler repair estimate, the electric bill, and a sheet where Mara had written the farm's operating balance twice because the first number seemed too low. The ducks had cost more to restore than she planned. The tractor still needed repairs. Hay production was already threatened. The bank wanted proof of meaningful cash flow before the end of summer. Mara leaned back and looked toward the mudroom. Her father's coat still hung there. In the warm kitchen, the faint scent of old canvas seemed impossible to detect from that distance, yet her mind supplied it anyway. Diesel, hay dust, winter air. For the first time, selling the highway parcel did not feel like defeat. It felt reasonable. She pictured survey stakes driven through the field, graders flattening the ground, concrete covering the place where her father had first let her steer a tractor alone. Outside, hundreds of ducks shifted inside the night paddock. Mara remained at the table past midnight. When she finally gathered the papers, a small red mark on that morning's field map caught her eye. 3 grasshopper nymphs in the south roadside strip. The previous week there had been none. At 5 the next morning, Mara was standing in ditch grass with her sweep net. The first pass brought up 6. The second caught 9. Tiny grasshoppers sprang from the fabric before she could count all of them. Mara drove 2 miles down County Road 14 and checked another ditch, then another. By the end of the week, every walk through dry roadside vegetation sent young grasshoppers scattering ahead of her boots. The county noticed soon after. At first, the insects seemed like one more irritation in a difficult summer. Some farmers sprayed field margins, others cut hay early. The heat continued. The grasshoppers grew. Their bodies thickened. Their jumps carried farther. Every day more moved from bare ground and rough pasture into green acreage. By late June, Mara could stand beside the south alfalfa field and hear them. Not loudly. That was what made the sound unsettling. A faint, constant ticking moved through the leaves as insects landed, fed, and jumped again. She released 2 duck groups along the boundary. The birds hunted aggressively, bills snapping at movement, bodies surging whenever a hopper broke from the grass. For several days the pressure dropped. Then a hot south wind arrived. It blew for nearly 30 hours across harvested wheat ground and abandoned pasture. On the second afternoon, Mara drove toward the south field and saw the road surface flickering ahead of her. Grasshoppers were crossing it. Thousands. The pickup pushed through them. They struck the windshield, bounced from the hood, and clung to the grill. When Mara stopped, the tapping against the truck faded, replaced by movement in the grass on both sides. She ran the rest of the way. The ducks were feeding. It did not matter. For every hopper one bird caught, more seemed to jump forward behind it. The outer alfalfa rows trembled with movement. For the first time, Mara understood that her plan might fail not because it had been foolish, but because the scale of the outbreak was larger than anything she had prepared for. By evening, ducks were panting from the heat. The water troughs emptied faster than she could refill them. Mara pulled the flock back before exhaustion killed the animals she depended on. At sunrise the next morning, nearly 20 feet of the southern edge had been stripped hard enough that pale stems showed through. Mara stood in the damage with both hands at her sides. Across the road, the neighboring field looked worse. That did not help. The bank deadline was 6 weeks away. If she lost the second alfalfa cutting, Hollow Creek's numbers would not work. The next 3 days became a fight, measured in hours. Mara split the flock into smaller groups and concentrated them where grasshoppers entered fastest. She sacrificed rougher outer strips instead of spreading the ducks thin. Birds moved before sunrise, rested in shade during the worst afternoon heat, then returned toward evening. Mara hauled water constantly. The old Ford overheated once beside the north ditch. Steam lifted from beneath the hood while grasshoppers landed on the windshield in front of her. She waited for the engine to cool, poured water into the radiator, then kept going. A portable shelter lost a wheel. A fence line shorted against dry weeds. 2 ducks died from heat stress before Mara changed the rotation again. The south field continued losing ground, 40 feet. Then almost 60 in the worst corner. At night, Mara walked the edges with a flashlight and found grasshoppers packed along the stems so densely that the vegetation seemed to move on its own. The ducks were not winning. They were slowing the loss. That became the entire strategy. Mara stopped trying to save every acre equally. She protected the strongest alfalfa first, then the hay ground closest to the barn, then the margins where incoming insects were thickest. One low-value strip was nearly surrendered. Every morning, she woke already tired. Every evening, the horizon turned red behind damaged fields. Then the county extension agent arrived. He parked beside the south line in mid-July and walked across toward the neighboring acreage. Grasshoppers rose around his boots in bursts. On Mara's side, insects still jumped, but not with the same density. The difference was not clean enough to photograph as a perfect dividing line. Nature rarely provided such neat proof. Once he walked the field, however, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The worst damage sat where the ducks had arrived late. Repeatedly worked strips still carried more leaf. Mara handed him her notebook. Its cover was warped from sweat, irrigation water, and being left once on the hood of the Ford during a sudden shower. Inside were dates, sweep counts, feed usage, bird mortality, temperatures, rainfall, paddock rotations, and every failed experiment she had tried. He read several pages in silence. 2 days later, another pickup turned into Mara's driveway. Then another. 3 farmers stood beside the south field where, months earlier, people had slowed only to stare at sick ducks. The oldest of them stepped through the gate and walked 20 yards into the alfalfa. He knelt, pinched a stem between his fingers, then looked toward the neighboring field where bare patches were widening. When he stood again, the amusement was gone from his face. His mouth tightened, not with disbelief now, but with the reluctant concentration of a man recalculating something he had been certain about. Another farmer rested both hands on the top wire of the fence and watched a duck group work the margin. He followed them for several minutes, eyes fixed on the way grasshoppers broke from the grass and disappeared beneath snapping bills. When he finally looked at Mara, his expression held no pity. It held respect he had not planned to give. A third man who had once smirked at her boots in the diner took off his cap, rubbed a hand across his forehead, and studied the paddock map clipped beside the gate. None of them congratulated her. Their silence was more satisfying than praise. The outbreak continued into August. Hollow Creek did not escape untouched. Mara lost forage along several boundaries. One corner of the south field never recovered enough for a normal cutting. She paid for targeted treatment where grasshopper numbers exceeded what the flock could suppress. By the end of the worst week, she no longer pretended ducks could replace every other tool. They were something more practical. They were the tool that kept her from needing every other tool everywhere. While neighboring farms sprayed entire fields more than once, Mara treated limited areas and kept ducks working the margins. The birds consumed insects, weeds, and field forage while gaining weight. Their manure returned nutrients to ground that had been losing organic matter for years. Most important, enough alfalfa survived. When the second cutting finally came off, Mara stood beside the field as the baler moved through evening light. Dust hung behind the tractor. The old machine missed a tie once and spilled part of a bale onto the ground. Mara climbed down, fixed it, and kept going. There were fewer bales than she would have wanted in a normal year. There were far more than she had feared in June. Across the county, hay was short. Prices rose. Mara sold part of her crop at a stronger price than she had budgeted, then sold a portion of the duck flock after the birds had regained weight. The rest she kept for the following year. None of it created a miracle. The farm still owed money. The tractor still leaked. The barn roof still needed work. But when Mara walked into the bank in September, she carried a folder thick enough to change the conversation. Inside were hay receipts, livestock sales, expense records, insect control costs, field notes, and a winter cash flow projection. She also carried a payment. Not enough to erase the debt, enough to prove Hollow Creek was still producing. The loan was restructured. The 32 acres beside the highway remained part of the farm. That autumn, Mara began noticing small changes around town. At the feed store, portable poultry netting appeared on a pallet near the front, instead of being special order stock. A neighboring vegetable grower bought a small flock of ducks. The county extension office asked for copies of several pages from Mara's records because her measurements were useful. The same trucks still slowed beside Hollow Creek. Now some turned into the driveway. Mara never reminded anyone why they had first come to look. Winter settled over the farm. After the first hard freeze, Mara carried her grandfather's notebooks upstairs and laid them across the old cedar desk. She cleaned the dirt from their covers and placed them in order by year. Then she set another notebook beside them, hers. Its pages smelled faintly of dust and feed. Near the beginning were records from the first miserable weeks after the ducks arrived. Mortality counts, medicine, feed, broken fencing. Near the middle were the rising grasshopper numbers. Toward the end came harvest weights, hay prices, and the bank payment. On the final page, Mara wrote 3 figures together: 800 ducks, 170 acres, 1 farm still in the family. She closed the notebook. The following April, Hollow Creek turned green again. Fresh alfalfa pushed through cool soil. Clover spread along the drainage ditch. New fence posts stood where Mara had replaced the worst of the old line during winter. The Ford still rattled down the lane, and the John Deere still left dark drops of oil beneath the machine shed. There was still debt. There would always be another repair, another forecast, another season capable of humbling anyone who believed land could ever be fully controlled. But there was no survey stake beside the highway, no development sign, no auction notice nailed to the barn. At sunrise, Mara opened the first portable gate. The flock burst through. Nothing about them resembled the birds that had arrived inside that sour-smelling trailer a year earlier. Their bodies were full and strong now, feathers clean enough to catch the morning light in flashes of white, brown, and green-black. Their calls rolled across the field in loud, confident bursts, rough and vigorous, no longer the thin, exhausted cries that had leaked through metal slats in March. Hundreds of webbed feet slapped against damp earth. The sound moved outward like rain. The air smelled of wet soil, clover, and new grass. Overnight moisture still clung to the leaves, releasing a dark, clean scent as the ducks pushed through them. It overwhelmed every memory of rotten straw, sickness, and stale trailer air. Mara followed with her notebook tucked into the back pocket of her jeans. At the south fence, she stopped where the grasshopper invasion had first crossed the road. She could hear the flock behind her, noisy and alive. For a moment, she did not write anything. Then she knelt and pressed her fingers into the cool ground. Her grandfather had noticed something small and written it down. Her father had kept the notebook. Mara had been desperate enough to read it carefully, stubborn enough to test it, and patient enough to understand that old knowledge did not have to remain buried in old pages. Later that morning, Mara found a single grasshopper clinging to the fence post above the south ditch. She watched one duck break from the flock, race through the wet clover, and snap it from the wood before circling back. Mara smiled, not because the insect mattered, but because the rhythm did. A year earlier, she had been fighting to keep sick birds alive. Today, the farm moved around her with purpose: strong wings, damp earth, green forage, and the steady sounds of life returning to Hollow Creek. From County Road 14, 800 ducks wandering through a field had once looked like proof that a young farmer had no idea what she was doing. Now their calls carried past the barn, over the ditch, and toward the road where trucks still slowed to watch. The difference was that nobody was laughing anymore.